41 days after she buried her husband, Rosalie Deschamps sat at her kitchen table in Bell's Crossing, Ontario, with $211 in her checking account, a funeral bill for $6,140, and a man on the phone from Sudbury offering her $300 for a fiddle she had never once heard her husband play in front of anybody but her. She said yes. Of course she said yes. The propane tank was at 18% and it was the second week of March, which in that part of the country is not spring, whatever the calendar tells you. And then she went out to the back porch to get the case, and she noticed something she had never noticed in 31 years of marriage. The green, velvet lining under the neck of the instrument sat a quarter-inch higher than the lining under the body. Like something had been slid beneath it. Like something had been slid beneath it a very long time ago, and then forgotten, or maybe not forgotten at all. Maybe left exactly where a person would find it, someday, when they finally got desperate enough to look. She peeled it back with her thumbnail. Inside was a folded piece of paper, soft as cloth from age, and when she opened it on the kitchen table under the light, she read the words, "Transfer deed of land," and below that, in a registry clerk's tidy blue pen, 40 acres, more or less, township of Kettle Hollow, district of Algoma. Transfer, Alton J. Pike. Transferee, Duncan Edward Deschamps. Dated the 11th of November, 1994. Rosalie sat down slowly, the way you do when your knees make the decision before your brain does. She had married Duncan in 1993. She had shared a bank account with that man for 3 decades. She had known the exact sound his boots made on the porch, and the exact way he cleared his throat before he said something hard. And she had never, not once, in 31 years, heard the name Alton Pike. She had never heard of Kettle Hollow. She had never known her husband owned a single square foot of ground beyond the 60 by 100 lot their little house sat on. If you're new here, welcome. We're Ultra Stories, and we tell the true feeling stories of ordinary people at the exact moment their lives crack open. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because we're going to be honest with you. What Rosalie found on that land was not treasure. It was worse than treasure. It was the discovery that the quietest man in Bell's Crossing had been living a second life for 30 years, and that everybody in 3 townships knew about it except his wife. Stay with us to the end. The last page of a ledger book is going to tell you something about Duncan Deschamps that he could not say out loud. Not once, in 31 years, and once you hear it, you'll understand why he hid the deed in a fiddle. But first you need to understand who these 2 people were. Duncan Deschamps was a millwright. That's what it said on his union card, back when there was a union and a mill. The Bell's Crossing pulp operation employed 410 men and women in 1993, and Duncan was one of them. And Rosalie worked the counter at the Guardian Pharmacy on Main, and between them they made enough to buy a house with a bad roof and a good woodstove, and to talk seriously. Over dinner, about a second child. Then the mill closed, February of 1994. There is a photograph in the Bell's Crossing library of the parking lot on the last shift, and if you look at it long enough you can pick Duncan out of the crowd. Third from the left, hands in his coat pockets, looking at nothing. 340 jobs, in a town of 2,000. What Rosalie remembered from that year was that Duncan got quiet, not mean, never mean. Duncan Deschamps went a full 31 years without raising his voice to her, which is either a miracle or a warning depending on how you look at it. He just got quiet. He'd take the truck out Wednesday evenings and come back around 11, and if she asked where he'd been, he'd say out at a fella's camp, and she'd say which fella, and he'd say nobody you know, and go wash his hands. And she let it go. That's the part she'd chew on later, at 3 in the morning, in an empty bed. She let it go for 30 years, because the rest of him was so good. Do you want to know what kind of man Duncan Deschamps was? Every single winter morning of their marriage, he went out 15 minutes before she left for work and started her car and scraped the windshield and knocked the snow off her wipers. 31 winters. She never asked him to. She never thanked him properly either, because it just became weather, the way the sun becomes weather. And on the morning of the 4th of March, when the temperature was -19 and the driveway was solid glass, she came out with her coffee and found the car cold and dark, and her husband on the ground beside the driver's door, with the scraper still in his hand. His heart, 61 years old. The paramedics came from the Sioux and did everything anybody could do. Rosalie was 57 years old, and she had a mortgage with 11 years left on it, and a daughter in Ottawa who called on Sundays, and a pharmacy job at $22 an hour, and no husband, and no idea Zero. That there were 40 acres of crown-patented bushland in the district of Algoma sitting in that man's name. So on a Saturday in the third week of March, she canceled the Fiddle sale and drove north. It's 90 minutes from Bell's Crossing to Kettle Hollow if the highway's clear and you don't stop. She stopped. She stopped twice, once at a Tim's in Thessalon, where she sat in the parking lot with the deed on the passenger seat and stared at it, and once at the mouth of the gravel road because she could not make her hands turn the wheel. Because here's what she'd been thinking about for 4 days. She had gone through the shed looking for anything else he'd hidden, and in a Maxwell House coffee tin on the top shelf behind a coil of chain she'd found receipts. Property tax receipts, Township of Kettle Hollow, 1995, 1996, 1997. Every year, unbroken, 30 of them, some of them for $180, some for $400 and change, all paid in cash, all initialed in Duncan's cramped little hand. 30 years, cash, out of a tin. From a man who had once made her put back a $12 cheese at the Valamart because it wasn't in the budget that month. You can imagine what a woman starts to think. Rosalie is not a suspicious person by nature, but grief opens a door and suspicion walks in and puts its feet up. She thought, another family? She thought, another woman. She thought about all those Wednesdays. 30 years of Wednesdays is more than 1,500 evenings, and she did the arithmetic on the drive north because that's what the mind does when you don't feed it anything else. The gravel road went 11 kilometers in, past 2 abandoned trailers and a cut block growing back in poplar. Then it dropped hard into the valley, and there was the Kettle River, narrow and quick and bright as a nickel in the March sun. And on a bench of flat ground above it, a shack. That's the only honest word, a shack. 20 by 30, board and batten going gray, a rust-red steel roof, a stovepipe with a rain cap, a porch with 2 mismatched chairs on it, behind it a woodshed, and in that woodshed stacked 5 feet high and 40 feet long was more split birch and maple than one man could burn in 5 winters. Rosalie got out of the car. The first thing she registered was that the path from the driveway to the porch had been shoveled. Not recently. There was a skiff of new snow over it, but sometime this winter, somebody had cleared that path down to the gravel and sanded it. Somebody who was not her husband, because her husband had been dead for 6 weeks. The second thing she registered when she put her hand on the door and it opened unlocked was that the wood stove was warm, not hot, warm. Coals still going under a layer of ash. Somebody had been in that building within the last 12 hours. And the third thing, and this is the part where Rosalie Deschamps stopped being a widow going through her husband's things, and became a woman standing in the middle of a story she had never been told, was the room itself. It was one long room. Along the far wall, a counter, a propane 2-burner, a hand pump for a well. Down the middle, a table made of 2 doors laid across sawhorses, and around it, 11 chairs. 11, no 2 the same, a Chesterfield with a moosehide blanket over the arm. A shelf of paperbacks with the spines cracked white. A guitar with 5 strings. On the wall by the door, a hand-lettered sign, painted careful the way a man paints when he's got all the time in the world and nobody watching. Wives. No bosses. No pity. Wednesdays 6 p.m. There is coffee. Rosalie stood in front of that sign for a long time. No wives. She had to sit down. She sat in one of the 11 chairs, and the chair was warm from the stove, and she put her face in her hands, and she thought about how many hundreds of times she'd said, "Drive safe" to the back of his coat on a Wednesday evening. And then she saw the ledger. It was on a shelf above the counter, a hardcover accounting book, green, the kind you buy at a business depot. Duncan's handwriting on the cover, nothing else. She opened it. Dates. Going back to 1995, and beside the C initials, and beside the initials, numbers. Nov 895, AP. Firewood, 2-cord Nov 1595. 7 men Nov 2295. 9 men Deck 695. Ran out of chairs. Page after page. After Wednesday. 30 years of Wednesdays, and here is the thing that stopped Rosalie's breath in her chest. About a third of the way in 2003, a name started appearing that was not initials. Ape 23. Juni 4893. Juni. Vus. So. 63. May 73. Juni called. She's all right. And then, scattered through the years after, like a stone dropped in a pond every so often just to hear it land. Juni. 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 Rosalie counted. 31 entries with that woman's name in them. Written in her husband's hand. In a building she had never been allowed to enter. Paid for out of a coffee tin. On land she never knew he owned. Let's pause right here for a second. Because we want to hear from you. Put yourself in that chair, in that warm room, with that book open on your knees. Your husband is 6 weeks in the ground. There is a sign on the wall that says no wives. And there is another woman's name, 31 times in his handwriting. Tell us in the comments what you would have thought. Be honest. Because we'll tell you what Rosalie thought, and it was not generous, and she has never once pretended otherwise. She was still sitting there when she heard the truck, an old Ford, the color of a wet penny, coming down the grade too fast for the ice. It stopped beside her Corolla, and the door opened, and out came a man so old and so slow that Rosalie had time to close the ledger and stand up and think 3 separate thoughts about what she was going to say. He was 84 years old and about 5'6" with the stoop taken into account, in a canvas coat and a toque with a Maple Leafs logo worn nearly white. He had 2 grocery bags in one hand and a bundle of kindling under the other arm. He came up the shoveled path like he'd come up it 10,000 times, because he had, and he pushed the door open with his boot, and he saw her, and he stopped dead, and his face did something Rosalie has never been able to describe properly. It fell and lifted at the same time. "Oh," he said. "You're Rosie." Nobody had called her Rosie in 30 years except one person. "He talked about you every Wednesday," the old man said. "Every single one. 30 years of it. We used to give him hell." Then he set the bags on the counter, and he took off his toque, and he stood there in the middle of that room holding it in both hands, and he said, "I'm sorry, missus. I couldn't come to the funeral. I don't drive at night no more, and there wasn't nobody to bring me." His name was Alton Pike. It was his land once. It had been his father's before that, a bush lot bought for back taxes in 1938. And he made her a cup of tea before he'd say another word, on that 2-burner, in a chipped mug that said, "World's okayest grandpa." And Rosalie sat across the door table from him, with a stranger's name burning a hole in her chest, and asked him, in a voice she barely recognized, "Who is Junie?" Alton Pike looked at the table for a while. "That's not mine to tell," he said. And Rosalie Deschamps, who had been polite her entire life, who had never once made a scene, not at the bank, not at the hospital, not at the funeral home, when the man tried to upsell her on a bronze urn, put her mug down hard enough to slop tea onto the door table and said, "It's the only thing in this world that is mine to know." The old man nodded slowly, like she'd said something reasonable, and he said, "Fair enough. Then let me start where it started, and you'll understand why I'm not the one who gets to say her name." Here's what Alton told her, over 3 hours, while the fire went low and neither of them got up to feed it. In 1994, the mill closed. Alton had 31 years in and he was 54, and he was one of the lucky ones because he had a paid-off house and a wife with a job at the school. His son Ray was not one of the lucky ones. Ray Pike was 29, 3 years married, a little girl and a baby on the way, and a mortgage in Bell's Crossing that he'd signed for 8 months before the announcement. Ray Pike and Duncan Deschamps had been on the same crew since they were 19 years old. They'd been each other's best man. They'd shared a lunch pail more times than either of them could count. That winter, Ray started sleeping in the day and sitting up at night. He stopped going into the Legion because he owed money there. He told people he was fine. He told Duncan he was fine. And Duncan, who was 29 himself and had a new wife and no idea in the world what to do with a friend who wouldn't look at him anymore, believed him or let himself believe him, which is not the same thing but feels the same in the moment. In October of 1994, Ray Pike died. Alton didn't say how. Nobody in that town said how, for about 20 years, and by the time they started saying it out loud, the men who needed to hear it had mostly already gone. He was one of 9 men from that mill list who died within 2 years of the closure, and only 2 of those 9 had anything a doctor could have written down. Rosalie remembered the funeral. She remembered it the way you remember a room you walked through on your way to somewhere else. She'd been 28. She'd made a casserole. She'd stood at the back. She had not understood. She'd asked Duncan, driving home, if he was all right, and he'd said yep, and turned on the radio. That was the winter Duncan Deschamps went quiet. And here is what Alton Pike said next in that shack, to a woman he'd never met. "In November, your husband come out here to my camp. It was Ray's camp, really. We built the first one together. It was half this size then. Duncan come out here to be alone, because he couldn't be alone at your house, on account of he didn't want you to see it. And I come out on the Wednesday because I couldn't stand my own kitchen. And we both showed up on the same night, missus, and neither one of us said a word for about 2 hours. He turned the mug around in his hands. And then Duncan says to me, he says, 'Al, I sat in the truck at the boat launch on Sunday for 4 hours.'" Alton looked up at her then, straight at her. And I says, "Doing what?" And he says, "Nothing." That's the trouble. I was doing nothing for 4 hours, and I couldn't tell you a single thing I was thinking about. And he says, "I got a wife who's got no idea, and I'm not going to be the second one this town has to bury. But Al, I don't know how to be the first one either." Rosalie did not move. So I says to him, Alton said, "Come back next Wednesday. That's all. That's the whole thing. Come back next Wednesday, and I'll have the fire on." And Duncan came back, and the Wednesday after that. And in January, Duncan brought a fella named Bud McCarrow, who'd been on the paper machine and was drinking his separation check. And in February, there were 4 of them. And by the fall of 1995, they'd torn down the old camp and put up this one, 20 by 30. And Alton signed the 40 acres over to Duncan Deschamps for $2 and other good and valuable consideration, because Alton was going to die someday, and the men needed somewhere to go on a Wednesday. And because he could not stand to have it in his own name anymore. Not after Ray. "Why?" Rosalie said. Her voice came out wrecked. "Why wouldn't he tell me?" Alton Pike thought about it a long time, and when he answered like a man who'd thought about it, long before she ever walked through that door. "Because you'd have looked at him different," he said. "That's what he was scared of. Not that you'd be mad about the money or the Wednesdays, that you'd find out how close it come. 30 years he was scared you'd find out how close it come, and every year he stayed alive it got harder to say, because then he'd have to explain why he never told you sooner." He set the mug down. "He wasn't hiding a woman from you, missus. He was hiding a man. He was hiding the man he was in November of 1994. And he built a whole camp on top of him, so he'd never have to look at him again." Rosalie Deschamps went out onto the porch of that shack and stood in the cold and looked at the Kettle River going by quick and bright. And she thought about a man scraping ice off a windshield at 6 in the morning for 31 years, so his wife wouldn't have cold hands, and she cried the way you cry when you finally understand you were loved by somebody who was drowning quietly, right beside you the entire time. Now, about Junie. Alton was right that it wasn't his to tell, and it took Rosalie 11 days to find her, and she found her the way you find anybody, she asked. She called the number written inside the ledger's back cover, a 807 area code, Thunder Bay, and a woman answered on the 4th ring. Her name was Junie Whitcomb. She was 51 years old and she'd been an RN at the regional hospital for 16 years, and she had 2 grown kids, one of them a paramedic. In April of 2003, Junie Whitcomb was 28 and living in Bell's Crossing with a man who had put her in the Blind River Hospital twice, and she was working nights stocking shelves. And she was trying to figure out how a woman with 2 children under 5 and $110 gets from Bell's Crossing to a shelter in Sault Ste. Marie, without her husband finding out. And she was crying in the parking lot of the Guardian Pharmacy at 11 at night, and a man came out of the truck parked beside her. He'd been sitting there, waiting on somebody. She never did learn who. And he tapped on her window, and when she rolled it down 2 inches, he did not ask her what was wrong. He said, "There's a place up the Kettle Hollow Road. Nobody's there but Wednesdays. Door's not locked, stove's laid. There's soup in the cupboard and the water's a hand pump. You take your kids and you go tonight, and Sunday I'll drive you to the Sioux, and I won't tell one living soul, including my wife." He wouldn't take money, Junie told Rosalie on the phone. Wouldn't take a thank you either. He drove me to the shelter on the Sunday and he gave me $40 and he said, "This is Wednesday money. It's not mine. It belongs to a fella named Ray." And then he shook my hand and he said the only advice he ever gave me, and I've thought about it every week for 22 years. Rosalie asked what it was. He said, "Don't be nobody's secret," and then he got in his truck and drove home to you. Rosalie sat on the edge of her bed in Bell's Crossing with the phone against her ear and the light going blue in the window, and she did not say anything for so long that Junie asked if she was still there. "He wrote your name in the book 31 times, Rosalie said. "He wrote everybody's name in the book," Junie said gently. "That's what the book was for, Mrs. Deschamps. It was so nobody got forgot. And now we have to tell you about the money. Because this is the part where the story stops being about a dead man and starts being about the living woman who has to make a decision." 9 days after Rosalie found the camp, her brother-in-law Giles Deschamps showed up at her door with a folder. Giles is not a villain. We want to be careful here, because it's easy to make him one, and he was not. Gilles was 64. He'd been laid off from that same mill. He'd spent 20 years driving a water truck for a contractor, and his hips were gone, and his savings were gone, and he'd loved his brother. He also happened to work part-time for a fella whose cousin was a land agent, and word had gotten around Bell's Crossing the way word does. The folder had a letter in it from Northlake Aggregates Limited. There is a granite and sand deposit under the bench of land where that shack sits. A good one, apparently, close to the road, close to the highway. And Northlake had been sending letters to Duncan Deschamps, care of a post office box in Thessalon, for 6 years. The current offer was $340,000. Rosalie sat at her kitchen table with the letter, and her checking balance and her funeral bill. And Gilles said the thing that a person says when they mean well. "Rosie," he said, "he'd want you looked after." Her daughter Colleen drove up from Ottawa that weekend, and she brought a printout of the mortgage amortization, and she was kind, and she was 32, and she was right about the numbers. "Mum, you're 57. You've got 11 years of payments and no pension. It's a shack. It's a shack full of old men. It's 11 chairs," Rosalie said. "It's a shack. There's 11 chairs, Colleen, and I want you to think about what that means. 11 men. On a Wednesday. In March. And Colleen, who had loved her father, and who had never in her life heard the name Ray Pike, said the sentence that hung in that kitchen for 2 months. Why should you sacrifice for a secret he kept from you? That's the question, isn't it? That's the one we want you to sit with, because Rosalie could not answer it that night. She lay awake, and she got angry. Properly, finally. 31 years of Wednesdays angry, and she said out loud to an empty bedroom, "You should have told me," and she meant it, and she has never taken it back. We'd love to know where you land on this. Drop a comment. Was Duncan Deschamps a good man or a coward? Or is there a version of a person who is both at once? And if you're getting something out of this story, hit subscribe. There are a lot of Duncans out there, and we tell their stories every week on Ultra Stories. Here's what Rosalie did. She drove up to Kettle Hollow on a Wednesday in the first week of April, and she got there at 4 in the afternoon, and she laid the fire and lit it, and she filled the big enamel pot with water from the hand pump, and she'd brought a turkey and 8 pounds of potatoes and everything else she had, and she cooked, and at 6 o'clock they came. Alton Pike first with kindling, then a man named Bud McCarrow, 71 now, sober since 1997, who stopped in the doorway when he saw a woman at the stove, and took his hat off like he'd walked into a church. Then 2 brothers from Iron Bridge who worked in the bush. Then a young guy, 26, in a Northern Ontario hydro jacket, who didn't say a word all night and ate 3 plates. Then a fella in his 50s with a paramedic patch on his coat sleeve, who turned out to be Junie Whitcomb's brother, and who had not known, until that spring, that his sister had ever spent a night in this building. 9 men. Then 11. Then when word got around that the Wednesdays were still on, 14, and they had to bring in more chairs. And Rosalie Deschamps stood at that 2-burner stove with her back to them, listening to them talk about absolutely nothing. Hockey, transmissions, the price of a cord of birch, a guy's granddaughter's dance recital, and she understood finally the sign on the wall. No wives. It wasn't about keeping women out. It was about a room where a man didn't have to be a husband, or a provider, or a failure, where he was allowed to be nothing at all for a couple of hours and then go home. She took the sign down anyway. She hung it on the back wall where you can still see it, and she painted a new one and hung it by the door. Every Widdaz, 6 p.m. There is coffee. Alton Pike laughed until he had to sit down. She did not sell to Northlake. But we're not going to tell you she found a way to have everything, because she didn't, and that's the truest part of this whole story. In June, Rosalie Deschamps sold the house on Elgin Street in Bell's Crossing. The bad roof, the good wood stove, the driveway, for $172,000, which is what a house is worth in a town where the mill closed in 1994. She paid off the mortgage. She paid the funeral home. She bought a used Yamaha generator and a proper cook stove and a 1,000-gallon cistern. And she insulated the walls of a 20 by 30 shack in the district of Algoma. And she moved into it in October with a cat and 11 chairs and 40 acres of bush. She still works at the Guardian. It's a 52-minute drive each way now. She has said more than once that it is the most peaceful 52 minutes of her life. Gilles didn't speak to her for 8 months. Then, on a Wednesday in November, his truck came down the grade too fast for the ice, and he came up the path, and he sat down at the door table and ate a bowl of soup, and never said one word about the $340,000 then or since. He comes most weeks now. He fixed the eavestrow. That's how a man like Gilles says he's sorry, and Rosalie, who had 31 years of practice reading A Quiet Man, understood him perfectly. Colleen came at Christmas. She stood in the doorway of that shack and looked at her father's handwriting on the ledger, and the guitar with 5 strings and the moosehide blanket on the arm of the Chesterfield, and she said, "He was here? Every Wednesday? My whole life?" And her mother said yes, and Colleen sat down in one of the 11 chairs and cried for an hour. Now the ledger. "We told you at the start that the last page would tell you something. Here it is." Rosalie had read that book front to back a dozen times before she noticed that the back cover was thicker than it should be. Same trick as the fiddle, same man. And under the end paper, folded twice, was a single sheet of lined paper, written in October, 5 months before he died, which is when, Rosalie later learned from a receptionist in Kettle River, Duncan Edward Deschamps had gone in for a stress test he never mentioned to anybody, and been told about his heart, and driven home, and started her car every single morning after that just the same. He'd written, "Rose, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you found the deed, which means you're the kind of person who takes a fiddle apart, and I always knew you were. Al will tell you the rest. I couldn't. I don't have a good reason. I had 30 years of chances and every one of them was a Wednesday and I let it go by. Here's what I want you to know. I did not stay alive for this camp. This camp is what I did after. I stayed alive because on the worst night of my life I came home at 2 in the morning and you'd left the porch light on and a plate in the oven, and you never once asked me where I'd been. I thought that was you not noticing. It took me about 20 years to figure out that was you letting me have the door. You gave me 31 years, Rosie, and I gave you a warm car. It wasn't even close to square, but it's what I had, and I meant every morning of it. The land's paid up to 2026. Firewood's in the shed. Don't sell it to those gravel bastards. Wednesdays at 6. There is coffee. And down at the bottom, so far down it was nearly off the page, like he'd almost not written it at all. Tell Al, I said it out loud once. He'll know, she told him. In the truck, in the parking lot of the funeral home, 11 months late. Alton Pike, 85 years old, put his forehead down on the steering wheel of a penny-colored Ford and stayed there a while. Rosalie Deschamps is 61 now. There are 22 chairs. On a good Wednesday there's soup for 30, and there's a woman from Thunder Bay who drives 8 hours down twice a year and sleeps on the Chesterfield, and there's a sign by the door that says everybody. Last February a kid came down that road on foot, in running shoes at 9 at night, in -22. 19 years old, maybe. He stood in the doorway and looked at the fire and the chairs and the strangers, and his whole face was a question, and Rosalie set a bowl in front of him and did not ask him one single thing. That's the whole trick. That's the entire thing her husband knew and never had the words for. You don't ask. You leave the porch light on. You put a plate in the oven. You say, come back next Wednesday, and I'll have the fire on, and then, this is the hard part. This is the part that takes 30 years. You actually have the fire on. If this story got you somewhere, subscribe to Ultra Stories, and tell us in the comments about the person in your life who was quietly holding something you never knew about. We read everyone. We think Duncan would have liked reading them too. The kid in the running shoes came back the next Wednesday, and the one after that. And in April, when the ice finally let go of the Kettle River, Rosalie Deschamps came out of that shack at 6 in the morning to drive to work, and found her windshield scraped clean, and the engine running, and the heat already on.